Well, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see all these smiling faces here to talk about how to make the world a better place. We're here to talk about economic mobility through rural housing. And this is something that, this is an area of the industry I've been working on for the last more years than I'm going to tell you, honestly. How many people in here work in affordable housing in some form or fashion? Okay, so none of this is going to get lost on you all. So this will all be familiar territory. I want to introduce first the panel, and then I'll give just a little bit of context to what is happening, I think, in some of the areas we're trying to highlight today. We have Maurice Jones, the president and CEO of LISC, a national intermediary supporting practitioners like Hope, like Fahe, and others across the country. We have Phil Eide, who's a member of the Hope team. He works on Hope's community development efforts, helping get the tax credits and needed subsidy and lending into projects. We have Duncan. Hey, Doug. He's a senior vice president and chief economist with Fannie Mae, a great access to market rate liquidity throughout our country to ensure the financing of affordable housing. And we have Phil. And then we have Joe. I'm sorry. I can't see exactly. We have Joe, who's president and owner of Wishrock Communities. He's developed over 15,000 units of affordable housing across the country. So to get started, I want to paint just a quick picture of what happens in rural communities of poverty versus the nation as a whole. In rural communities of persistent poverty, we've all talked this morning about the fact that the market doesn't work. And the market doesn't work in these communities not just for people needing affordable housing, but across the spectrum. And the challenge is both on the supply side and the demand side. And I hope no one does calculus and wants to check these numbers. This is for demonstration purposes, not on a case-by-case basis. But, you know, the median income in Holmes County, Mississippi, which is 42 miles from here, from where we're sitting today, is $21,375. And that $21,000 median household income is compared to $61,000 and change throughout the entire nation. So a third. So people in homes have a third of the buying power of people anywhere on average across our country. Similarly, they can pay a third less, So what ends up happening, though, is that we see that the median purchase price in homes is about $30,000 more than somebody can afford to spend, whereas across the nation as a whole, the median purchase price is about $29,000 less than what they can afford to buy. So already, folks can't afford to pay as much as they need to for a home. And then on the demand side, it's costing about $10,000 more to build a home in these communities than they'll appraise for or can be sold for. And in communities across America, median houses are selling for more than for $43,000 above the median house price. Sorry, I'm stumbling just a tad bit here. I think it's the after lunch crowd. So already we're working in a deficit on two sides of the coin here in communities of persistent poverty. So what I'd like to do is ask my colleagues a couple questions, and I think I'm going to start with Doug, if you don't mind. Great. Doug, as Fannie Mae has a duty to serve rural communities, can you give us just a brief overview of that and how you see it playing out in communities of poverty?
Sure. First, let me say thank you for the invitation to be here and for the opportunity to sponsor. It's certainly aligned with our charter and public mission, so we're very pleased to be here and be invited. Also, I have a Mississippi connection. I grew up about 40 miles from the headwaters of the Mississippi, It's colder up there, so it's nice being down here. So duties to serve is actually a regulation that was enacted in December of 2016 under the authority of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and it was put in legislation in the HERE Act of 2008, and then ultimately developed and issued in 2016. The core of its intent is, with regard to housing, is to improve mortgage financing in manufactured housing, in affordable housing preservation, and in rural housing. And all three of those are interrelated in many ways, as you might know. We actually have a place on our website. I'm sure Freddie Mac, who has the same rules as we do and is also a sponsor, he has the same thing on our website. If you go to fanniemae.com/duties to serve, there's a whole bunch of things on there that give you some view of the things that we have done, want to do, are doing, and figure out where you can plug in. What are some of the challenges? Obviously, that's been talked about a lot this morning, but I'm an economist, so if I don't have data, I feel I'm not justified to participate. So just a couple of notes on data. In this recovery, which is soon to be the longest, there are still about 20% of communities who have not reached the level of employment that they had before the recession. Now, part of that was discussed earlier, and it's out-migration of young people from rural communities. That's a real problem and a development problem for sustainable communities. And I think the governor focused on a couple of communities that are successfully showing entrepreneurship that will keep employment in that space. I'd argue that going forward, that's going to be a really big focus for communities to focus on. The New York Fed actually did a study recently. They were looking primarily at student debt and it as a hurdle to homeownership, but as part of that study, they pointed out the degree of migration of young people from rural to urban areas, which is a kind of an alarming thing. Between 2011 and 2013, looking at the different kinds of loss of housing, in the manufactured housing space, in that time frame, we lost 161,000 housing units. From condemned or damaged buildings, we lost about 212,000 building units. And of demolition or disasters, we lost about 470,000 units of housing in just that time period, 2011 to 2013. So that, given that there was already a shortage of affordable housing, that simply aggravated the problem. We just haven't caught up. So what are we doing or trying to do about that? One of the first panelists talked about data. And one of the things that allows you to understand either a borrower's circumstance, the nature of collateral, or geographic distribution of properties is data on that. In lots of rural areas, there are actually limited amounts of publicly available data on which you can base decisions. So one thing that we're doing is we brought together the whole ecosystem of manufactured housing parties, people that produce it, people that sell it, people that run communities, people that live in it. And we offered up on a database all of the data that we have within the company to anyone who was willing to share the data from their part of the ecosystem so that we could try to improve the efficiency of that market, because it is clearly an affordable housing type. And I live in Florida, and there's lots of manufactured housing that's good quality housing that's in the area that we live in Florida. So that's a place we're attempting to improve data that's available for decision makers in thinking about affordable housing. One of the other things that we're trying to do on the data front is we've done a lot of work on appraisals, and in many rural areas, the distribution of properties are such that it's difficult to get accurate appraisals on which to base loan-making decisions. So we've been trying to change some of our rules and improve some of our technologies to improve appraisals, which should help make the lending process more efficient. As you know, we are involved in sharing data with lots of the counseling agencies and with some of the community development agencies to try to help improve consumer information. So that's kind of on the demand side. We're interested in sustainable lending, not just making a loan, but rather making sure that that loan is made to somebody who can sustain that loan, because we've seen the cost of foreclosures at the household level. And one other thing, I've got a bunch more things that I think will go around again. One other thing I wanted to point out was we've been investigating the effort at Auburn University called Rural Studio, and the Atlanta Fed was mentioned. They just published an article in the Atlanta Fed about the Rural Studios program, where they can build affordable, high-quality rural housing, single-family detached, for about $20,000. It's a project through their architecture program, and we think that has a lot of promise as one possible outcome. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Doug. Maurice, as a national intermediary partner, can you talk about what LISC is thinking about doing as you're expanding more into rural communities, especially those of persistent poverty?
Good afternoon to everybody. Nice to be with you. I think a couple things to mention on our thinking on expansion. First is geographic. So the LISC has 35 or so offices around the country. And then we're working now in about 2,000 rural counties in 44 states. If you look at where our offices are in particular, we are, in my mind, vis-a-vis where poverty is growing, underrepresented in the Southeast, in the South. And so we are expanding southward. That's the first thing to be said. And so we're opening an office in Charlotte right now. We're opening an office in Atlanta right now. We've expanded in rural Virginia. We've expanded in rural Texas. I see Suzanne back there. I'm sure I'm missing others, but the bottom line, Wyoming, that's not quite south, but I'm with you. Although it's south of Alaska. You're right. So the first thing is south. We are attempting to expand our partnerships and our work southward. The second piece is we have been for some time now aspiring to be a comprehensive community development organization, one that, yes, does its share of housing, but does a number of other things as well, facilities and health, and I'll come back and talk about that in a bit. The biggest sort of new growth lane for us from a body of work is economic development. And under that economic development, we lodge three things. Comprehensive talent development, which is more than just workforce. It's workforce development coupled with financial literacy education, coupled with casework around social services that people need, transportation, child care, pulling down their earned income tax credit, et cetera. So that's one prong, if you will, of the economic development piece. The second piece is financing small businesses and entrepreneurs, helping, in particular, entrepreneurs of color and women expand and get underway. And then the third piece for us is attempting to partner with folks to build or rebuild commercial corridors in underinvested places. And that's usually about taking real estate that has been abandoned or underinvested and getting it back on the market and getting businesses in it, and using our ability to finance that as the way in which we attempt to thrive. So those are probably a couple of the things that I would say represent the themes of our expansion.
Great, thank you. Joe, as an experienced developer working all across the country, what motivates you to come into communities like communities of persistent poverty outside of the scorecard?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. And a couple of preliminaries for me. One is I'd just like to congratulate Hope and all of you who work at Hope on your anniversary and on your partnership. I appreciate it. Second, I should tell you all that I'm principally a developer, but I've been asked to talk a little bit today about a nonprofit that my family founded 7 years ago that's based here in Mississippi, and it's called Springboard to Opportunities, and I think it's a pretty unique organization. I should say that we came down here just on the heels of Katrina, and within a few years we had a portfolio of about 1,500 units in Mississippi. And the residents of these properties were by far the poorest and the most, I should say, had the least agency of any of the populations of tenants or residents in any of our properties around the country. So I was feeling like we had some kind of an obligation to do something to at least provide some opportunity for these families to improve their lives, and thought that we could form a resident services organization that did more than basic resident services, which are offered in many low-income properties around the country, but what I thought of as transformational residential services. So with a little luck and help from some local organizations, we set up Springboard and hired this really dynamic executive director out of the Foundation for the Mid-South, whose name is Aisha Niandoro. And today, Springboard is offering services to about 1,300 families here in Mississippi, and I think that they're doing really amazing work. And just some examples of what we're doing at Springboard. One is after-school programs for the children. We have clinics at several of our properties that offer free medical services through a partnership with University of Mississippi Medical Center. We have a program which is called Lit World, which brings together young people who are interested in writing and reading, and they in turn not only work together, but they go to national conferences and conferences in other parts of the world, which gives them a much more expansive view of what's out there. We have what we call a Success Academy that we've now graduated 175 women from. It's a 12-week program, and it's a pretty cool program because it prepares them for employability or for going on to the Hinds County Community College, which is just across the street from a couple of our properties. And at the end of this 12-week program, these women, and they are all women, we have a graduation ceremony and the families are there, and it's really heartwarming to see. We have a family self-sufficiency program at some of our properties, and we just recently partnered with the major foundation on a guaranteed basic income experiment where we've taken 20 families and we have committed to providing them with $1,000 a month apiece for a year, which they can use in any way that they see fit to use, because the whole idea is to see whether giving people more income will improve their lives without the need for external direction. We also have 20 families that are a control group who are not getting the support, and at the end of a year we'll evaluate the success of this program. And received a lot of national attention. It's just getting launched, and we're pretty optimistic about it. We're hoping that, you know, we can demonstrate something there that could make a real difference. So what else are we doing? Well, you know, I could go on and on. We have partnerships with food banks. We have summer camps for the kids. We have assessment and referral services for our residents who might have different needs that, and we have partnerships with groups in the community, nonprofit groups in these communities. And the whole idea here is, and this I think gets kind of to your question, what is the motivation for us for doing this? And the motivation is basically a double motivation. One is a business motivation, and that is having these kinds of programs and having this type of support for our residents enhances our reputation and gives us more opportunity to develop this type of housing. It also helps stabilize our resident populations and makes them into more responsible residents. And that's on the business side. And on the non-business side, which I call the heart side, you know, I grew up, I've been in this business for 50 years, and I grew up during the Vietnam era. I was a young man at that point, and the civil rights era, and my value system was formed by all of that. So the reason that we're doing this is the same reason that we do, or that I do affordable housing, which is that it seems like a valuable thing to do. It fits my value system, and it gives me the opportunity at this stage in my life to feel like all that this calling of affordable housing has done for me, I'm able to give a little bit back and hopefully make some sort of a difference. So with that, I'd just like to speak for just a minute about the affordable housing issues also. I should have said to you folks, all of these programs that we operate through Springboard are not funded by the government. HUD has a program that does provide some funding for supportive housing, but it's limited to resident services for elderly people, and the services we're providing are not in our elderly properties, they're in our family properties. So we're actually funding those out of a combination of operating funds from our properties, philanthropy from my family, and grants from external funders. And we're operating now in 4 states, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Maryland. And we're hoping that as we have more success, that we'll be able to expand to some of the other total of 23 states in which we have properties. And we continue, as we do all of this, to do our affordable housing development. And Mississippi is an area that we've got a real concentration in. We just closed a deal where we're partnered with the Jackson Housing Authority in converting a public housing property to privatized housing, still affordable under the RAD program. We have some rural housing projects throughout the country, none here in Mississippi, and I can only tell you all, as you all know, I'm as eager as you are to learn how to do affordable housing in rural communities because it's really a heavy lift.
Thanks a bunch, Joe. Phil, can you speak as boots on the ground in Mississippi, actually helping put projects together? What do you see as the primary needs and opportunities in the communities?
Yeah. Thank you, Sara. So, you know, Lisa Mensa said this morning, I think she said, we all know what to do. And I thought that after I heard Lisa say that, and I knew I was going to be coming up this afternoon, I could just say that again and drop the mic and we could go and do, right? Because that's really what it's about. We know what to do, and it's a matter of getting it done. So I've been at HOPE for 20 years now, and HOPE is a very different organization today than it was when I started 20 years ago. And even 5 years ago, I was thinking about this recently, 5 years ago, if we would have been sitting around the office and talking about where HOPE might be 5 years later, and we would have said, HOPE is going to have a cluster of Delta offices in Moorhead and Itta Bena and Drew and Shaw and Utica, and we're going to be doing a subdivision just outside of Moorhead, Eastmore, that needs to be done. And we're going to have this convening at Valley State where everybody's going to come together with the Federal Reserve Chair. Bill would have been very serious with that conversation. The rest of us might have chuckled a little bit of, yeah, I guess, maybe, but here we are. And so I wonder 5 years from now, where will we be? We have plans, we have dreams, we have thoughts, but how will we be, and not just hope, but how will we be in a different place than we are 5 years? And we got to where we are 5 years later from that hypothetical date because we rolled up sleeves and did it. Opportunities came our way, partners in this room came our way, and we made things happen. So I think I'm getting to the answer to your question. I think I am. But one of the things that we started a couple of years ago doing is that I'm real excited about, and I think it's just the right way to do things, is our small town partnership work. And it's been mentioned a couple of times, and Bill actually talked about HBCU work, which is very parallel. It's on a parallel track and very similar to what we do with small town partnerships. But in our small town partnership work, we go into the community, meet with elected officials, develop relationships with mayors and other leaders in the community, but also community members. Call together community meetings. If you bring food, folks will often come. So we bring food and we say, come and tell us what you need. Tell us what's going on in your community that we need to know about. And no surprise, we did that in 7 communities. No surprise that the list, the top 5 was pretty much the top 5 in each community. The order might have been just a little bit different. And it's affordable housing, it's healthy foods, it's a grocery store, it's economic development, it's education. It's the list that we know, but they prioritize a little bit differently. But the concern at those meetings, and we got some really good feedback from the communities and put it in a little document. But what we promised those communities and those folks that helped to put this document together is that we're not doing a planning document. We're not going to do charts that hang on the wall. We're doers. We believe that we need to do something about this. And so as has been mentioned earlier, the Catalyst Fund that we have gets us started pretty quickly with some immediate projects. And many of you here met Mayor Moorhead in Moorhead yesterday. Phenomenal mayor. But we did a few Catalyst projects. It was putting some play drums out near the Cotton Museum that he's got. It was rebuilding some playgrounds and adding some equipment to some of the playgrounds that were there. It was running some water lines to some water fountains in the parks that hadn't worked in years and years. And Mayor Holland said to me after that work started, he said, these might seem like pretty small projects and relatively, inexpensive and thousands of dollars here and there. But he said just anything in our community gives us hope. Anything that they see being done that's improving our community gives us hope. So no, we're not stopping there. Obviously, that's not enough. But that's enough to get folks started and starting to believe that we're serious about what we're doing. In Eide, right across the street, they have some significant electrical problems. They own their electric utility. Half of the electricity that comes into town never gets to the houses because the structure is in such poor condition. So and that came up on the list, very unique to Eide. And so we're working with Eide first to identify the problem and to quantify the problem and then figure out what some solutions are to problems like that. So I think what we do at Hope, and I'm blessed to be able to have this job at Hope for 20 years, is to identify those problems, work with residents, work with community leaders, elected officials, and see what we can find for solutions. And I wanted to mention this one more thing because we are doers, but Doug, we also know data. I mean, that's the beauty of Hope is not only do we just go into community and have conversations with folks that live there, but we've got some really smart folks that also dig into data. So we understand, I got a whole list of it here, but I'm not going to read it to you. But, we understand what the poverty level it is, how many folks in that community make less than $10,000 a year, how many are elderly, how many have a college education, a college degree, all those things we understand. And we have folks on staff that if you want to talk about healthy foods and grocery stores, they can get into square feet and the number of sales that have to happen per day in order to sustain those number of square. And we can get into that stuff. But the bottom line, I'm coming back to what Lisa said, we know what to do.
Thanks, Phil. So I'm going to stick with you, if it's okay, for just a second. We'll go from the boots on the ground back up the hill to the sort of national market. But can you talk a little bit, can you give an example of how you've braided both public and private resources together? And in that, how do you see banks and foundations helping to address the quality of housing in the Delta?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about a couple of things. One of them is our low-income housing tax credit program that we work with the Wishcampers and the Wishrock folks on. We've been doing that for about 15 years now. So low-income housing tax credit dollars that flow through in Mississippi flow through Mississippi Home Corporation. First off, we have a very good relationship with Mississippi Home Corporation and with the other state housing finance agencies. So we get to sit at the table with Scott and tell him what we think about how the best way to use those funds in. So honestly, that's an important piece, right? And we're fortunate that Mississippi Home Corps wants to hear those things also. So first, it's that relationship with the agencies that are handling the money. The Federal Home Loan Bank sitting right in front of us. The AHP program is one of the, in my opinion, one of the most phenomenal programs that we've got for yes, thank you, for affordable housing. And this is why. It's not because they have billions and trillions of dollars that we talked about that we'd like to see, but they're consistent. You know they're going to be there, you know what they're going to fund, you know where the money's going, and you know how to go after it. And so we have partnerships with folks like that, and also they're wide open and want to hear about ways to spend their money and ways to use it better. But I'm getting off track now because I could go table by table and tell you that we appreciate, but the low-income housing tax credit program has been consistently a good program for us to lend into. We're a permanent lender to those deals, and they're generally smaller, oftentimes rural deals, where they need a loan under about $1.5 million. Believe it or not, that's a small loan to some of the larger bankers in the room know, but that fits us perfectly. It's the right size for us, and we're filling a niche of a loan that needs to be made. So blending a federal program and a loan from the credit union, and we get, I'm going to keep going now, NeighborWorks and Don Phoenix provides us occasionally some additional grant funds, or with AHP funds, home funds, different grant funds that we can blend with our loan to make the project. And what we do with that is go even deeper and find those projects that otherwise couldn't get done. I'm going to stop because I'll just keep going if I don't.
Hey, thank you so much, Phil. Joe, if I can pass it over to you. You know, I think you're as I understand the work at Wishrock, I mean, you guys you're doing this as a business, and yet you're putting a lot of your own philanthropy back into projects. How do you choose rural communities? What characteristics of rural communities are you looking for before you start to make an investment of your time and resources in them?
Well, I think I touched on that when I was talking about Springboard. We look to put these funds and this effort into our poorest communities, for sure.
How do you pick a community to go into to do a new development? For
do a deal?
Yes.
Ah, yeah. Well, yeah. So there's no real stock answer to that. You know, it's a combination of things that amount to opportunity for us. So, for example, here in Mississippi, it was Katrina and the GO Zone funds that occurred after Katrina. Once we were here, though, we found that it was a very receptive community statewide to support affordable housing efforts. Home Corps is a really good agency to work with. Our partnership with HOPE was really important. There was a tax abatement program, and I want to mention that to everybody too. There's a statewide tax abatement program for affordable housing in this state that lowers operating expenses and makes it easier to have feasible deals. And that program came under attack a few years ago, and fortunately the attack was beaten back so that the affordable housing tax abatement program still exists. That's a really important tool for us. Local communities, you know, part of it is assessing how much affordable housing's been built in that community in recent years and how, how great the need is. And unfortunately, and this is really kind of the nub of the affordable housing problem in rural areas, the area median income is a really important factor. And so the lower the area median income, the lower the rents that you can achieve will be, and therefore the lower the amount of money that you have to service debt is, and that in turn affects the feasibility of the projects. So that then puts us in a position where we need to look in states where there are other resources available to make these deals work, because we have, in lower income communities with low AMIs, you need a stack of resources. You can't just do a deal with tax credits and first mortgage debt. You have to have all kinds of supportive debt, soft debt, debt that doesn't necessarily amortize, grant funds, AHP funds, home funds, National Housing Trust funds, philanthropic funds, and on and on. And yeah, so all those things kind of have to come together in a matrix, and ultimately you make a decision based on whether you feel like you have a deal that you can not only make work financially, but also that you can get funded through the state agency.
Thanks, Joe. Maurice, as you look out from your more national platform, can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing some promising opportunities, especially in housing, and how it relates to other community development needs? Housing Plus.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most promising Housing Plus opportunities is in the health space. And in fact, our fastest growing bucket of partnerships are actually in the healthcare arena, either with hospitals or, knock on wood, with healthcare payors. And if you look at what we're doing in rural America, we've helped to finance the construction and expansion of FQHCs, healthcare clinics, senior living facilities, facilities that are serving folks with that are psychiatric hospitals, essentially. Healthcare is probably the biggest single lane that we're seeing now as a place that is both recognizing that they have to work with housing, and in a lot of cases actually getting into the housing space themselves. We have a huge hospital, Kaiser Permanente, for example, committed a $200 million investment in housing, affordable housing across the country, and we're doing some work with them. So I would tell you that probably the biggest Housing Plus new work that we're seeing is certainly in that space. We are working to help to construct or rehab facilities that are designed to help people who are wrestling with the opioid addiction. I mean, health is really, to sum it up, the place where we're seeing the most activity.
And are you seeing that work translate into our rural communities as well?
Yes.
And can you give an example of that?
Yeah.
Because I know, like, when we've talked about the payees, for example, how do you translate connecting the payees with smaller communities?
Yeah, so the examples that I gave you really were all in rural areas. The assisted living, the senior living piece, the healthcare clinic, the FQHC, those were all, and the opioid piece, that's all rural America.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's great.
You all probably know it, but hospitals themselves in rural America are in a tough shape, right? And so we're also getting opportunities to, frankly, be part of, or maybe the only part of the capital stack that helps these hospitals do the kinds of things that they need to, frankly, try to stay alive. So I think that's the place, both from an opportunity perspective and honestly from a pain point perspective, where we're seeing in rural America a huge housing plus opportunity.
Great, thank you. Doug, we heard this morning from our friend Dan Latendra about how, I think he used the words, banks' frigidity, the antidote to that are CDFIs. And I know both the GSEs in the room here are looking at CDFIs. Can you speak a little bit to how you see Fannie in particular partnering with CDFIs to reach deeper into the market? And I think in relation to this question is CDFI's purpose is to serve part of the ecosystem that the traditional financiers won't. So how do you see Fannie working with CDFIs?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that beforehand, but I was sitting here thinking about his comment about the box and whether it fit the box. When the qualified mortgage rule went into effect in post-crisis, I called a mortgage banker who's been kind of a mentor of mine for a number of years. He was in the business for 50 years, and I asked him, how has that changed the way that you do business? And he said, well, I've always made my business by having the loan underwriters live in the communities where they were underwriting the loans, so they actually knew the people. So he said, we know all the families and all the people in all those communities, and we know that even though the credit record of one of the adult children in one of those families might not be pristine, that we know they're good for that. And previous to this, we would have made that loan and taken that risk because of our knowledge of the community. Today, if we make that loan and take that risk and it goes bad, we get punished seriously. So we just don't make those loans anymore. That's a space where the CDFIs can come in. And because not everyone, full disclosure, I bought a set of encyclopedias when I was 22. Not a pristine investment, and I paid for it on installment, right? So not all of us manage credit perfectly coming right out of the box. So there's it's also a place where the duties to serve rules gives us the ability to have some flexibility in working with people. And we have, on the qualified mortgage rule, we have an exemption. If the GSEs will take it, you can make that loan. Now that expires in a couple of years, and there's been a look back at it to see what the impact of that is. But we're committed to that. In rural housing in 2017, we did 30,000 units of rural housing, and about 3,800 of them were in places like the Delta, high needs areas. That was up from 24,000 the previous year. Actually, the high needs number was down a little bit from 5,500 in 2016. So we're committed to that space, and we recognize that there needs to be some flexibility, and we have the regulatory room to do that. The low-income housing tax credit was mentioned. We're invested in a number of equity funds doing low-income housing tax business. Some of that for small apartment deals that you were talking about, the $1.5 million loan or whatever. That's a loan that we would do under that low-income housing tax credit program. We're also doing some things in the green financing space. And there's two elements of that. One of it's a little bit of a public relations piece, but there's a piece that's real in terms of global investors. And so we actually have a focused program now to meet the investment priorities of global capital markets for green financing. There's a very strict set of criteria that you must meet. Our objective in that is for properties that meet those, it reduces utilities costs to households. It actually makes those properties more affordable for the residents living in those. So that's a different way we're trying to get at the affordability question.
Okay, thanks. I think as we get walk down the road here together. We're all talking today about these communities, these rural communities of poverty, and we would like to know if you have one last item you'd like to talk about or point you want to make sure gets across today to the crowd. Maurice, you want to start us?
Look, I think that we have to keep in mind that race and culture are issues in all the work we do in rural America, as well as urban America. And so you can't take race out of the complex issues that we deal with when it comes to rural America and culture as well. And so we are seeing great disparities in rural African Americans and rural whites. That's just the bottom line. And we're in the black belt right now. And so I know you all who know about this know about it, but we got to make sure that we're, as we're attempting to do equity in rural America, that we realize that we have issues of race and culture in rural America just like we have it in urban America. And so we are definitely seeing that in the work we're doing and trying to make sure that we are making special, if you will, efforts to serve the entire population that makes up rural America. So I would just leave that with you as what I would add as an addition.
Thanks.
You know, I'm going to keep mine really, really short and simple and thank Lisa for saying it this morning. We know what to do.
That's short and sweet. I grew up in rural America on a dairy farm in western Minnesota in a house without plumbing till I was about 9 years old. So I've always had an interest in high quality, affordable housing. That hasn't changed at all. But I will say that capital flows where people go. So key is the personal relationship in all of this. And what we find in our research among young people is that contrary to the points of view that you hear from technologists about being able to do everything electronically, when it comes to buying a house, they want someone to talk to. That will always be the case. So to the extent that you're engaged in their life, that's your opportunity.
Well, I'd like to talk just a second about the rural housing programs of USDA, what's called the Rural Housing Division of USDA. There's probably a couple million units of Section 515 rental housing that was built primarily in the 70s and 80s that's in probably overall pretty poor shape today and needs an effective program for recapitalizing these properties so that they don't deteriorate to the point where they're not useful resources in these rural communities. There is really not an effective program to do that at the moment. So that would be the first thing about rural housing. And the second thing is to say that this 515 program that did exist for about 20 or 25 years and was funded for about 20 or 25 years at a fairly robust level, offered 50-year mortgages at a subsidized rate of interest, and that made feasible properties that would never have been feasible otherwise. It would be great if we had a program like that today because we could produce a lot of housing.
Thank you. So I think I noticed just a couple themes as we heard from the panelists today. The first is, I think housing isn't a sector in and of itself. It's grouped together with other needs in the community. So LISC is branching out into areas of health as well to try to combine housing with health for affordability. Fannie and Freddie as our GSEs, have made a commitment to rural America and are talking about how to address those needs. I'd be real interested, and this may be a question in the midst of this, Doug, on those smaller homes, what the financing mechanism is going to look like will be a real interesting thing. I don't know if you guys have started thinking about that at all yet.
We're thinking about it, but we haven't resolved the product yet.
Yeah, great. And because the traditional financing mechanisms of homes depend upon appraisals, and how do you deal with that on tiny homes? I find it really interesting, Joe, to hear about your work in the rural communities, and especially about the philanthropy back into the projects for the success of the residents. And I think it's interesting that you see that as a social benefit and a business benefit on both sides. I would be interested in hearing more at some time about how we encourage more Joes in the world. We nonprofits try to be Joe, and you guys are figuring out how to do that. And so there's an amount of learning I think we could do from you, more than what we have time for here today. And Phil, Hope has made a tremendous impact on the Delta, and I think the ability to layer those capital stacks, the way you guys have gotten so good at doing, is what's making the difference. I think in order to, if I may quote our friends Nick Mitchell-Bennett from this morning, that's good, but we need more better. We need more money because it's not enough yet. So we've heard that in the themes from the day. I want to thank you guys for your time, and that's what we have, folks.